Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing great. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much. And all the better because you've joined me for a story tonight. And do I love these stories? I really love stories. And I'm so glad you do too. So before we get started with this lovely story we've got tonight, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's continue with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. The old woman stood in the tiny little kitchen, emptying out a small container of Kitty's delight onto one of the most resplendent china plates from her prized, most prided dinner service, as Brandy always deserved the finer things in life, the very best. The old woman was sure the cat appreciated the gold leaf rim around the corners of the plate. The dinner service, of course, had cost an absolute fortune, but that was beside the point. She gingerly checked the label on the Kitty's Delight container to ensure it was the right flavour, for there were times she'd returned home from the store with the wrong flavour, and that had never gone down well with Brandy, who was a very discerning cat, and you couldn't easily pull the wool over his eyes. Brandy was beautiful. He was the colour of grey smoke, and had the most magnificent amber eyes. In certain lights he sometimes almost looked ghost-like, when he discreetly slipped past you in the dark. The old lady thought he resembled a blue Burmese, although what breed he was she didn't know. Brandy, of course, assumed he was proudly aristocratic, and had blue Burmese lineage, which was probably true based on his very distinctive appearance. It was very apparent that the snooty, self-entitled, rather indulgent cat did not think he belonged with the riff-raff of cat society, which of course included the downtrodden feral cats that had never known the benefits of a fine, luxurious lifestyle, like the privileges that Brandy had, of lying by the fireside on a sumptuously cosy, soft couch on a cold winter's night, thoroughly enjoying the warmth of the flames as they crackled away merrily in the hearth, or getting your food delivered to you by your human owner that could easily be persuaded to do your bidding, if you meowed for long enough and kicked up a significant amount of fuss. Brandy was very particular about all the food he ate. God forbid if the old lady dared to bring home any other flavour besides Kitty's Delight in pilchard, prime steak or chicken and liver. Those were the only 3 flavours Brandy would ever eat, and experimentation with other brands of cat food from his human owner was absolutely off limits. Brandy was rather partial to the occasional piece of poached salmon, or leftovers from the lady's roast chicken, which she ate every Sunday for lunch as a matter of routine. For everything about Peggy Warmonger was structured, and she devotedly lived her life by routines. Ostensibly, if Brandy took a dislike to the food the old woman gave him, he would always express his extreme indignance by playfully putting his furry paw in the plate and pushing the food around, as if to say, "That's disgusting! There's no way I'm going to eat that!" And surprise, surprise, he never did, for the old woman was very malleable and could be easily manipulated. If Brandy was hungry, he would continue to meow and meow and meow and meow until the old woman opened another tin, which was a flavour that Brandy approved of, and when that happened, Brandy was an extremely happy cat. On this rather unassuming Friday morning, Brandy was purring profusely, rubbing his sleek, grey body against the old woman's stick-thin ankles. He slipped under the folds of her long skirt, covering it with his fine, silken hair. Brandy liked to mark everything by rubbing himself against it, and the old woman belonged to him, as did everything in the cottage. Whether the old lady knew this was irrelevant to the very presumptuous cat, who didn't take kindly to the long stream of visitors that would let out the other side of the cottage for holiday breaks and weekends. Brandy did not trust the strangers as far as he could throw them, and the occasional guest that would stay at the cottage, whom had dared to try and stroke him on occasion, and not escaped unharmed, for Brandy had lashed out at them with an angry claw, and occasionally very satisfactorily drawn blood. Mrs. Warmonger had been somewhat embarrassed by Brandy's antics and inappropriate behaviour, She would apologise profusely for her cat, and explain that he was not friendly to strangers. But people, of course, they never listened. They'd say, "Oh, don't worry about me. I'm good with cats. Cats love me. Oh, isn't he so cute? He's so lovely. Look at him." They would bend down to stroke him, despite Mrs. Warmonger's warnings, and then they would get a nice big scratch from Brandy, and cry out in pain, and look at Brandy as if he was the devil incarnate. Mrs. Warmonger would bite her lip awkwardly. People were so stupid, she would think to herself. I warned them Brandy wasn't friendly, but they wouldn't listen, would they? They always think they know better. If they got scratched, then that's entirely what they deserved. Mrs. Warmonger did not realise that she was as untrusting and cynical of strangers as her cat was. They were rather like two peas in a pod, for they both had a distinct aversion to having their peace disrupted by the visitors that frequented the property, that would on occasion be as noisy as the seagulls. Mrs. Warmonger had seen them all, people from walks of life that she could only imagine. Some moved into the cottage for a few days, weeks, or even months, from rowdy teenagers to families enjoying a break, professional people looking to escape the city, or romantic couples. The list went on and on. All right, Brandy. Keep your fur on," said the old lady. "Your food is coming. Give me a moment, will you? I'm not as agile or as sprightly as I used to be. We aren't all built, you know, to be as nimble as you are, Brandy." Brandy took no notice of the old woman's indignance, but continued to rub his sleek, silky body against her ankles, which he always did when he was impatiently demanding food from the woman. This behaviour always got his human carer to bring out the food pretty promptly. "All right, it's ready," said the old woman, tapping the countertops to tell the very presumptuous cat the food had been dished out on the plate for him to enjoy. Brandy didn't hesitate to jump up onto the countertop. He liked to perch on the high level and eat. Brandy sniffed the meat very suspiciously, in case the old woman had duped him. You couldn't be too careful about that, could you? With these human providers, they always needed to be kept in line. Sometimes they could get the food they presented to you badly wrong, and Brandy would have none of it. Brandy was exceedingly spoilt, but once he was satisfied the old woman had dished out his favourite prime steak, he began to hungrily dive into the plate of food approvingly. The woman sighed with relief. If Brandy was happy, then so was she. It had come to the old woman's attention that Brandy was gaining a sizable pooch, probably from eating an excess of calories, which she was responsible for, because she couldn't help but give in to the cat. Even the vet, Mr. Carmichael, had looked at the old lady questioningly and said, "How much are you feeding Brandy, Mrs. Warmonger? If you don't mind my saying, he's getting rather porky." You know, Mr. Carmichael, I give Brandy small portions. He doesn't eat that much, you know," she lied, for she didn't want to be accused of being a bad owner who was neglecting her cat's ever-increasing waistline. Mr. Carmichael had looked puzzled. "Well, maybe someone else is feeding your cat, Mrs. Warmonger." Mrs. Warmonger nodded her head in agreement. "Well, it's a possibility, Mr. Carmichael," she said rather lamely. "You know, we have guests that stay in the other half of the cottage that the Trustlers let out to holiday makers. It may be that such people might be rather tempted to feed Brandy. I mean, everybody loves Brandy. Can you blame them? He's a very good-looking cat." "You should discourage such behaviour, Mrs. Warmonger," said the vet. "Maybe you should tell your guests not to spoil your cat. Obesity among animals and the feline population is becoming a big problem here in North America." The old lady had bitten her lip, so much that she'd actually drawn blood, and could taste its saltiness on her tongue. If Brandy got obese, so be it. Mrs. Warmonger was not going to deny her cat the good life. That was more than her own life was worth, whatever Mr. Carmichael might have to say about the matter. So she nodded at Mr. Carmichael obligingly and said, "I'll do my best, Mr. Carmichael," knowing full well that for the foreseeable future Brandy would not be embarking on any calorie-restricted diets, for Mr. Carmichael didn't have a clue how demandingly obstinate Brandy could be. And if she didn't give in to Brandy's every whim, life that she would be subjected to would not be very pretty. The old woman glanced out of the window of her kitchen in the old cottage. She had never tired of the prepossessing views that she feasted on every single day, that overlooked the majestic great expanse of the ocean. She could see the sea was calm today. It was a deep blue colour that in certain lights almost looked turquoise. Ever since she was a little girl, Peggy Warmonger had always loved the ocean. She had lived in this cottage that belonged to the Trustler family for the last 30 years or so. Time had gone by so fast. It seemed like only yesterday she'd moved into the place. The sizable cottage had been divided into 2 parts. This had all happened in the 1970s, when the 2 Trustler boys, who were now in their early 20s, had inherited the cottage from their late grandmother. They had decided that rather than sell the place, that they would divide it in half, so that they could own a half each, and both enjoy coming down to the cottage for weekends with their respective families, which they did for a while, until their wives decided they wanted to visit more exotic locations for holiday breaks. It was then in the 1980s, the 2 Trustlers decided that they would now rent out the property as a way of bringing in extra income. Keeping their grandmother's house seemed like a good idea, for they had no desire to sell. That was when Peggy Warmonger had moved into Dreamy Heights. Mrs. Warmonger had been given her accommodation free from the Trustler boys, who had given her the responsibility to take care of all the visitors that would frequent this part of the world, to stay at the property for short holiday lets. The Trustlers liked to feel that someone responsible was living on their property, overseeing all their guests. So Mrs. Warmonger got free accommodation, and the Trustlers paid her handsomely to keep the cottage clean and to help the estate agents manage the guests that would come here to stay. Some people stayed at the cottage for weeks, others for months, some for days. But Dreamy Heights was always in demand. Many people came to this remote, rather rugged part of the Oregon coast to escape the rat race of city life. Over the 30 years that Peggy Warmonger had been in residence here, the cottage had hosted writers, poets, and artists alike coming to stay here, and all manner of interesting guests. Although she had, of course, hosted some nightmare tenants, but the less said about those unsavoury people, the better. The guests she was expecting today were a Mr. and Mrs. Songbird. She wondered, with people who had names like that, whether they were musically inclined or great at singing. Only time would tell. She had spoken to Mr. Songbird, a man who insisted that she called him Bernie. She had met him 2 weeks prior, when he'd visited the cottage. He'd come to look at the place, which he described as perfect for him and his wife's needs. When people viewed the cottage, that was what they would always invariably say. The cottage and its location were so dreamy, hence the name Dreamy Heights was the name that the Trustler boys had given to their grandmother's cottage. It seemed very appropriate. The decor was so sumptuously cosy that many guests had come back to Dreamy Heights again and again, year after year, to enjoy this stretch of rugged coastline. Bernie had looked rather awkward when Mrs. Warmonger had asked if everything met with his approval and satisfaction. "Oh, but of course," he had said, "this cottage is absolutely perfect for me and my wife. My wife has a baby. It's about 6 months old now, so it will be the 3 of us moving in. I trust this will not be a problem for you, because we will need to make one of the smaller rooms into a nursery, and a cot would be appreciated, of course, if that is not too much trouble for you." The word baby had got Peggy Warmonger's immediate attention, for she loved babies, but she tried her level best not to show the eagerness and enthusiasm in her dark brown bird-like eyes. A baby in residence at the cottage? This was music to her ears. Who would have thought of it? This would be a first. Dreamy Heights had sometimes had children staying over at the cottage for a couple of weeks, but more often than not, most of the visitors were usually adults. But a baby, this was welcome news indeed. "A girl or a boy, Mr. Songbird?" she had asked nonchalantly, somewhat trying not to appear too interested. Peggy Warmonger was hoping that Bernie would say it was a girl. As far as she was concerned, girls were so much better than boys. They were sugar and spice and all things nice after all. Boys were puppy dog tails and stuff like that.
It's a girl. Her name is Molly. She's very sweet, cute little thing,
said Bernie, his eyes bright with the adoration of a devoted father, who perked up immediately when he talked about his own child.
Pretty name, Mr. Songbird,
said Mrs. Warmonger approvingly.
I'll set up a cot for you in one of the small rooms and make it into a nursery. It'll be opposite the main bedroom. It won't be a problem, I can assure you of that. I hoped you would say that, said Bernie. I appreciate that very much, Mrs. Warmonger.
He paused for a brief moment, as if he was somewhat hesitant to speak any further.
Just one more thing, Mrs. Warmonger. My wife, well, she's been suffering from postnatal depression, and so that's why I thought living here for a while might lift her spirits. I think coming somewhere quiet and rather remote and wild would do her the world of good. That's what her psychologist believes anyway. She needs her space, you see. This will be the quintessential opportunity for her to paint and read and generally relax, if you know what I mean. She's been very highly strung of late.
I see, said Mrs. Warmonger, clenching her lips tightly together. For Peggy Warmonger never liked to express her emotions, and she never wore her heart on her sleeve. As far as she was concerned, showing your feelings was as vulgar as hanging out your dirty laundry for all to see. Mr. Warmonger flushed, his skin going the colour of a pink peony. He then continued,
The doctor gave my wife meds. They've helped a lot, of course, but he did recommend it would be worth my wife's while to have a break. I wanted to find the perfect cottage on the coast, not far from where I work, so that the commute won't be too bad. I'll be working in the Coo Bay area. My company is setting up a business there, you see. I'm overseeing the start-up for about 6 months or so. My wife might be alone in the cottage for long hours. That concerns me a little, Mrs. Warmonger, as you can imagine. So I was hoping, if this is not too impertinent of me, that as you're living on the other half of the cottage, that you might keep an eye on her, just to make sure she's all right. But of course, Mr. Songbird, I will be delighted to help in any way that I can. But I hope you don't mind me being rather blunt and impertinent, if I may. But your wife, she's not a suicide risk, is she? It's just that it should concern you if she is, because we've got some dangerous cliffs around here. And I would hate to think, well, you know.
Mrs. Warmonger could not complete her sentence, because she felt incredibly uncomfortable discussing Mr. Songbird's wife with him, especially as she didn't even know the woman.
No, I'm glad about that, you can rest assured. She's not a suicide risk. She's been battling depression, that's all. But she would never ever dream of harming herself or the baby. Little Molly means the world to her.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that, Mr. Songbird, said Mrs. Warmonger. I'll try to keep an eye on her.
I'm very grateful, Mrs. Warmonger, very grateful indeed. You have no idea how much I appreciate that. We will take the cottage for the next month or so, and if things go swimmingly for us, we may end up staying for 6 months. We will see where we go to from there.
Mrs. Warmonger glanced out of the kitchen window on this Friday morning, when she was expecting the songbirds soon to arrive. She never checked the regular forecast on the radio. It was notoriously unreliable. She was rather bemused that over the years the meteorologists, with all their high technology, got the weather so horribly wrong over and over again. Mrs. Warmonger only had to observe the colour of the ocean with her naked eye, and she would always be able to have a sense of what the weather would be like that day, and her deductions were always right on the money. This morning the prognosis for the rest of the day was not that great. The sky was an ominously grey colour. The dark blue colour of the ocean suggested that this was going to be a rather overcast day, with plenty of misty cloud cover, and a light wind, with a very high probability of light rain. Why Peggy loved the ocean, she did not know, but the ocean was a part of her as much as her own breathing was. She couldn't imagine living anywhere else in the entire world but here on the spectacular Oregon coast. Yes, she would admit the water was cold here, unlike in Florida, but she liked it that way. Besides, she'd never been much of a swimmer. Every morning, like clockwork, she would sashay down the beach, regardless of how bad the weather was. And sometimes, if she was incredibly lucky, little Brandy would follow behind her, like a small devoted dog. No doubt the cat, like everything else, believed that this craggy, rather rugged stretch of coastline, which in reality was rather a small beach, if you could call it that, surrounded by uneven, rather jagged cliff faces, and rather precarious, irregular-looking rocks that clustered together on the edges of the beach to form what Peggy would describe as rocky islands, abundant with sea life. The little beach was fringed on the right-hand side by a heavily wooded area, with pretty little footpaths that would lead you down crooked, rather unpredictable trails to other miniature beaches on this stretch of coastline. When Mrs. Warmonger's dog, Mr. Rochester, was alive, he was a black Labrador. He had the time of his life trotting down some of those trails. A lump came to Mrs. Warmonger's throat when she thought of her beloved dog, because she rarely missed him so much. But old age had got him in the end. "Now that you've been fed, Brandy, I'm going to check on my babies," she said. The cat meowed, and Peggy happily sauntered off to the nursery that was papered in a pretty yellow and white daisy design. There were 2 white wooden cots in the nursery. There had, of course, been 3, but she had placed the 3rd cot in the nursery next door for the songbirds to use for their 6-month baby girl called Molly. She'd even gone to the trouble of painting the little room yellow and putting up small teddy bear stickers on the wall, so the room looked like a nursery, and she prided herself with the great job she'd done. The baby would really like this room, she was sure of that. Peggy glanced over at the 2 cots in satisfaction, reaching out to grab one of the little bundles, which she cradled lovingly in her arms. She loved little Viola, with her soft dark baby hair and purple blue eyes that stared up so innocently into her face. She rocked her baby gently in her arms, making little shushing noises. "There's a good girl. Aren't you being so good, Viola? How about I change you into your pretty yellow outfit that matches the wallpaper in here? You'd look good in that, don't you think? Just like a real princess. You want to be a princess, don't you?" Whether Viola did or did not, she failed to answer. Instead, her purple eyes stared up at the ceiling rather vacantly. Peggy began to change Viola, very gently, as she always did. "There you go," she said, looking satisfied at the work she'd done, and patting her baby. Viola did not whimper, nor did she make a sound. "I told you that you'd look so pretty in this, Viola. And you look like the perfect princess, don't you?" She sighed when she remembered that the songbirds would be here soon enough. She needed to get the other half of the cottage ready before they arrived. She'd run a hoover over the place very quickly, dust the furniture, and put up some vases of flowers and fresh fruit around the place to welcome the guests. Bernie had asked her to stock up the refrigerator with fresh produce, which she had done faithfully, so she could cross that off the list of things to do. She reluctantly tossed Viola back into her cot, so one of her chubby little arms dropped out from beneath the crochet blanket. Peggy briefly glanced over at the other bundle in the remaining cot, feeling a tad disappointed that she couldn't attend to the other baby right now, which was a dreadful pity, but it couldn't be helped, could it? "I'll check on you later, Daisy. Mummy's got stuff she needs to do. Plenty of stuff," she whispered to the silent, unmoving bundle in the other cot. Standing in the doorway, Peggy blew her 2 babies loving kisses and quietly closed the nursery door behind her, because she didn't want to wake the sleeping bundles. There was Brandy again at her feet, rubbing himself between her legs. It seemed now Brandy, who had been demanding food only moments before, now wanted attention from Peggy Warmonger. But Peggy had things that needed to be done, and there was no time to lose. It was always important to conduct herself as professionally as she could, and she wanted to make sure that the cottage was in good nick when the songbirds arrived. Peggy Warmonger prided herself on being a perfectionist. She knew guests staying at Dreamy Heights would be very challenged to find a speck of dust anywhere after she had fastidiously cleaned the place, for the windows gleamed and everything was polished. Gemma Songbird had been dozing off in her husband's silver BMW. It was so stuffy in his car. Her husband Bernie had insisted on turning the heat right up. This was so typical of him. The temperature was cloyingly uncomfortable,
She was sweating under her armpits, and it was down her back as well. In summer, Bernie put up the air conditioning at full blast, and she would be so icy cold in his car, and was always forced to put on a cardigan or a jacket. But when the weather was on the slightly cool side, her infuriating, insufferable husband insisted on turning the BMW into a swelteringly hot sauna, with scorching temperatures that were hot enough to make you remove your winter layers, as if it was a smoulderingly hot summer's day. Luckily, little 6-month-old Molly was strapped in a baby seat at the back of the couple's BMW. She seemed comfortable enough. The rocking of the car seemed to have sent her off to a restful slumber. They hadn't heard a peep out of her since they'd left the Coos Bay area. Gemma had dressed her in a very light onesie, wisely predicting that her husband Bernie would turn their BMW, if given the chance, into a tropical rainforest before they even reached their destination. Gemma, of course, had argued tirelessly about the unreasonable high temperatures in the BMW. Bernie seemed to like extremes of temperature, so her arguments about the air conditioning system being either too hot or too cold always fell on deaf ears, and eventually just flatlined. In the end, out of sheer frustration, Gemma had accepted the status quo, and that the temperature in their car would never ever be to her liking, even though little Molly didn't seem to complain a bit. But luckily it was a short journey from Coos Bay, where Bernie had touched base with the office where he intended to work for the next 6 months or so. The previous day they had travelled all the way from their home in San Francisco to Coos Bay, and that had been over 9.5 laboriously drudgerous hours spent in the car, listening to Bernie's favourite opera music that had driven Gemma mad. So this trip to the Oregon coast was a lot shorter, which was a relief, as yesterday spending such a long time in the car had been pretty close to insufferable for Gemma. She abhorred long journeys at the very best of times. If she had her way, the family would fly everywhere, but Bernie had an aversion to doing this. Gemma's husband Bernie worked for a boutique company in San Francisco, where the couple currently resided. He had agreed to oversee the start-up company in Coos Bay. Bernie rarely wanted to get Gemma out of San Francisco for a while, but he had been met with a staunch resistance from his wife, who didn't enjoy being thrust away from her comfort zone like this, and was not agreeable to a change of any kind. Gemma adored San Francisco, and was very unenchanted by the idea of moving away from the vibrant, rather noisy city where she lived, even if it was only for half a year. As usual, Bernie got his way. He could be remarkably persuasive when he wanted to be, which was probably why he was so good at his job. Coos Bay would be under a 2-hour commute to this obscure little cottage on the Oregon coast, where they would be staying. But Bernie had insisted such a commute was not a big deal for him if he left very early in the morning. Coos Bay was the largest deep-draft port between San Francisco and Puget Sound in Washington state. On this shorter trip, Gemma had fallen asleep, but her head banged lightly against the passage-side window, and when it had hit the window far too hard, she'd finally opened her eyes. She could smell the scent of fresh apple, and heard her husband Bernie making loud crunching sounds with his lips as he chewed into the apple hungrily. "Why do you chew with your mouth wide open? I can hear you from here, Bernie. I can't believe you. You're eating again. We only ate breakfast 2 hours ago." It was true. They'd only eaten breakfast a couple of hours earlier, after they left the B&B that they had been staying at overnight. Gemma was still feeling substantially full, after their kind host had insisted on cooking them a hefty breakfast and ploughing them with enough food to feed an entire family of 5. "You, my dear, look like you need feeding up," her host had said pointedly to Gemma. "There's nothing on you at all, my dear. But hopefully, while you're staying at the coast, you'll get some flesh on your young bones. The sea air can make you very hungry, you know. It's hard for me to believe you gave birth to a baby. Your figure is so trim." In the last 6 months, Gemma had lost a great deal of weight, so she was very skinny these days, and everyone told her how incredibly lucky she was to be this way. But at this point in her life, with the depression she had struggled to overcome, lucky was almost certainly the last word Gemma would have used to describe herself. These days she barely recognised the gaunt, very pale face staring back at her in the mirror, her blue eyes almost bulging out of their sockets,
while her dark hair had lost so much of its lovely gloss. "Are we nearly there, Bernie?" she asked, slightly impatiently, as she glanced out of the window. The views over the ocean were spectacularly beautiful. Even she had to admit that, ever so begrudgingly, as she really didn't want to be here. She could see that her husband Bernie was driving over a very steep cliff edge in what seemed like a wild, untamed part of the coast, where stretches of unabashful dark ocean stretched out before them under a shimmering, rather overcast sky that looked lugubriously sorrowful, almost as if in any moment some rain might just burst out of the clouds and begin to sprinkle their car with some ethereal feather-like droplets of water. Bernie turned around to give his wife a rather smug grin. He couldn't help himself. He felt very pleased with himself to be here, and to escape San Francisco.
"Look, it suspiciously looks like it might rain. It's become incredibly overcast, has it not? The good news is if my GPS is accurate, which I believe it is, we are nearly there. Not long now. For a while you dozed off there."
"Well, are you surprised, Bernie? It's so stuffy in this car. Really stuffy. Must you always put the temperature in here so high? You're a salamander. I'm telling you. I can't believe we haven't heard a peep out of Gemma. You'd think she'd be complaining bitterly about the heat in here. I'm actually sweating in the car. Water is literally running down my back. And I'm not joking either."
Bernie frowned. "Must we go over this again and again and again, Gemma? You're beginning to sound like a broken record. The temperature in this car is perfect. I don't like driving when it's too cold. It affects my fingers. Anyway, if the temperature was so bad, don't you think we would have heard some noise out of Molly? Babies are very sensitive to temperature fluctuations, you know."
"If you say so," said Gemma, making a disagreeable face. She almost wished her 6-month-old baby would have made a sizable fuss, so that Bernie would have been forced to turn the temperature down. But it seemed little Gemma, much like her father, seemed to enjoy living in a sweltering sauna. Bernie opened the window to discard his apple core, allowing some cool briny breeze to enter the car, which was pleasantly invigorating, and for a brief second brought much-needed cool air into the car. Gemma secretly wished he'd keep the window wide open, but that was never going to happen. They drove through a small town and past a scattering of pretty little houses that looked picture-perfect along the way, against the undulating hilly slopes that overlooked the coast. Even Gemma found herself thinking how pretty it was, as she observed a couple of seagulls soaring into the sky. Before long, Bernie's car rolled up a steep elevation, and then there, nestled in a rocky outcrop overlooking the ocean, was a perfect-looking cottage that looked like something Gemma had seen in the Scottish Highlands when they had visited Scotland to stay with Bernie's grandparents, who were both of Scottish lineage. Bernie looked a little Scottish himself, with his pale blue eyes, fair skin, and his strawberry blonde hair, and on some occasions he wore a kilt in the traditional way, without wearing any underpants. It was funny how people would giggle and say to Bernie, "Are you wearing the kilt the proper way? You know what I mean? Like a true Scotsman, and letting everything hang loose."
"Absolutely," Bernie would say with a cheeky grin on his face. "I've got Scottish blood running through my veins, haven't I? I don't want to betray or offend my heritage by wearing things incorrectly. Or some of my past ancestors might haunt me in my sleep, and I wouldn't want that."
"You wish,"
his friends would tease.
"With the greatest of respect, Bernie, I think your ancestors have greater concerns in the heavenlies than worrying about whether you're wearing your underpants or not." When Gemma had met Bernie's grandfather over 4 years ago, she had realised that Bernie and his grandfather were pretty much carbon copies of each other, and shared so much in common. Both had a similar dry sense of humour. Furthermore, both men were interested in playing golf, and eager chess players. They were thinking men that always applied their brains. Bernie had an incredible brain on him, which made him an ingenious pioneer in the workplace, and because of his innovative ideas, he had been headhunted by the boutique company over 7 years ago, and never looked back. Gemma, on the other hand, was much more fanciful, and enjoyed overindulging in artistic pursuits, and reading was a great passion with her. She had told Bernie on their visit to Scotland how much she adored the cottages in the Highlands of Scotland, and how she would dream to live in a place like his grandparents did, with oodles of charm and character. She loved the enchanting stone walls steeped in a rich, vibrant history, the delightful whitewashed exteriors, the cute sash windows, the large, generous fireplaces, the nooks and crannies around the cottages where you could find peculiar-shaped cupboards and low ceilings that were covered with interesting wooden beams. She didn't expect to find a cottage like this on the Oregon coast of all things. So its surprising, rather idiosyncratic appearance for this part of the world had delighted her, as wistful, nostalgic memories of the blissfully magical time she had spent in Scotland with Bernie and his grandparents came flooding back, bringing happy tears to her eyes. Bernie had not told her much about the cottage they'd be living in for the next few weeks. She hadn't expected it to be anywhere near as nice as this, but if this was where they'd be staying, it was a game-changer. Yes, she could imagine living here for the next 6 months or so. The idea had been for the couple to find a place, a cottage to rent for a few weeks in a remote place on the Oregon coast, and if it worked out, they'd stay here for 6 months and then return home to San Francisco. But Dreamy Heights embodied charm and character. It was only a pity that, according to Bernie, there was an eccentric old woman living in the other half of the cottage, who Bernie described as a little aloof. Gemma would have liked to have the whole cottage to herself, but you couldn't have everything, could you? So there we are. That is the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.